The sun was slow to rise that morning. It filtered through the gray mist like warm breath through a paper screen, lighting the cobbled path in front of the tea house with soft golden strokes. The street vendors hadn't arrived yet. The bells of the northern temple hadn't rung. Only the wind moved, brushing dry leaves against stone, carrying the scent of boiled rice and wet earth. That was when Li Mei saw him again. Same place, same silence. He sat by the edge of the western wall where the alley met the narrow drainage canal, his back pressed against the stone, one leg stretched out awkwardly in front of him, wrapped in torn fabric and old blood. His hands were folded in his lap, thin and still. His face was turned slightly away, but the lower half was always visible. The sharp jaw, the split lip, the trace of stubble he could no longer shave. And the eyes, when he opened them, were not the eyes of a beggar. They were the eyes of someone who had once known something greater. But no one else seemed to notice. Children passed without looking. Vendors stepped over his worn sandals. The butcher's boy called him Cripple under his breath. The baker's wife had once thrown stale bread at him, like feeding a dog. Li Mei never spoke when she approached. She simply set the bowl down. Warm rice, sometimes a piece of pickled radish. Once, when she had a few coins left, a boiled egg. Then she walked away. No words, no thanks, no name, just silence. But silence, Li Mei had learned, could carry more than noise. It could carry memory, grief, dignity, and sometimes it could carry trust. She had first seen him 2 months ago. A collapsed shape in the rain, no umbrella, no shoes. Just a thin figure slumped against the temple gate, one leg twisted unnaturally, clothes soaked, skin gray with fever. She had paused, looked once, then again. And then, without thinking, she had knelt in the mud and touched his shoulder. His eyes had opened, wild, dark, desperate. She hadn't spoken. She had only given him water, a few drops from a cracked gourd. He had taken it with shaking hands, drunk slowly, then leaned back and closed his eyes. Li Mei hadn't asked who he was. She hadn't asked what had broken his body, only whether he needed food. He had nodded once, and so she had returned. That night, the next morning. The next week, always the same. A bowl, a quiet nod, an unspoken agreement between strangers who did not ask questions. That morning, as she set the bowl down, she saw him flinch, not from pain, but from shame. His eyes met hers. Just for a second. There was no anger, no demand, only something deeper, a look that asked, "Why are you still doing this?" She didn't answer, not with words. She only straightened his spoon, placed the boiled turnip gently beside it, and bowed once before turning back toward the kitchen door. Her apron was stained with tea leaves. Her sleeves smelled of smoke and vinegar. Her sandals were cracked, and her shoulders ached from carrying water since before dawn. But somehow, the ache didn't feel heavy that day. Not when she knew someone was waiting. Not for charity, but for dignity. That night she dreamed of him, not as a beggar, but standing, straight, tall, wearing a robe the color of storm clouds trimmed in gold. He was facing a courtyard, back turned to her, and at his feet was a bowl, her bowl. She woke with her heart pounding, and for the first time in weeks, she whispered into the dark, "Who are you really?" The next morning, the sky was pale and flat, like parchment left out in the rain. Li Mei moved through the small kitchen with quiet hands. She wrapped the rice in a thin cloth to keep it warm, added 2 slices of lotus root, rare, but she'd found a vendor selling yesterday's leftovers. She placed everything in the same wooden bowl, the one with the small crack along the rim, and tied it carefully with a blue ribbon, the same way she always did. And then, without a word, she stepped into the street. The beggar was already there, as if he never left, as if he didn't sleep, as if he were part of the stone itself, worn, unmoving, half forgotten by time. But something was different today. He was sitting straighter, His legs still bent unnaturally, but his back was no longer against the wall. His hands rested on his knees. His eyes, dark, sharp, strange, followed her as she approached. She knelt and placed the bowl in front of him. Still, she didn't speak. She didn't have to, but this time he did. Why? The word was soft, broken even, like it hurt him to say it. She looked up. His face was thinner than she remembered. His lips cracked, his jaw bruised. But his voice, even in one word, was not the voice of a beggar. Not entirely. Li Mei tilted her head. "Because you're hungry," she said. He shook his head slowly. "That's not what I meant." She didn't reply. Instead, she unwrapped the ribbon, placed the spoon gently into his hand, and stood. He didn't stop her, but before she turned to go, he whispered again, "People don't give for nothing." Li Mei paused. Her fingers tightened around the empty cloth. And then in a voice barely above the wind, she said, "I wasn't always given things either." And she left. Back in the tea house, the day moved slowly. Patrons came and went. Tea was poured. Rice was steamed. The old man in the corner grumbled about politics. A child knocked over a bowl. Someone asked for more vinegar. Li Mei moved through it all like smoke, quiet, unnoticed, constant. But her thoughts were not in the room. They were with the man who sat in silence, with the question he had asked, and with the truth she had not said. Because deep down, even she didn't know why she kept coming back. Maybe it was the way he never begged, never reached, never even looked up unless she stood still long enough for him to feel it. Maybe it was because he reminded her of her brother before the fever took him, or her husband before the war, or herself before she learned how to disappear in a room. That evening, when the shutters were closed and the street had emptied, Li Mei found herself standing by the window. The bowl was back. Someone had returned it, cleaned, dried, and inside, folded like a secret, was a leaf of mulberry bark, written with elegant, uneven ink strokes. "You don't owe me anything, and I can't repay you, but still, thank you." She turned it over. No name, just a single mark near the edge, a symbol she didn't recognize, like a seal or a crest. She traced it with her finger, and for the first time she wondered, what kind of man knows how to write like that but sleeps in the dirt? The mark haunted her, not in a frightening way, but in the kind of way that stays behind the eyes, even when you're pouring tea or sweeping ash. A curl of ink, a symbol too practiced to be random. It wasn't the mark of a merchant, or a farmer, or even a wandering monk. It was careful, measured, royal, but Li Mei told no one. She folded the bark gently, wrapped it in cloth, and tucked it into the wooden box where she kept her father's comb and the dried plum blossom from her wedding day. That night, she dreamed again. This time, he wasn't wearing rags. He stood by a fire, robes dark and thick with dust, a sword at his back. Soldiers knelt before him. He turned to speak, but his face remained in shadow. When she woke, her heart was still beating fast. She told herself it was just a dream, but part of her wasn't sure. The days blurred together. She continued her work, prepared bowls, carried water, listened to the old men argue in the corner about land taxes and bandits on the eastern road. But every morning before the sun fully rose, she brought the same bowl to the same place. And every morning he was there. Some days, he nodded. Other days, he said nothing. But once, as she handed him the spoon, their fingers touched. Just for a moment. And she noticed the scar on his palm, a thin, jagged line, old, healed, but deep. Not from labor, from battle. The town began to notice. A vendor near the tofu stall asked her once, "Why do you feed him?" She didn't answer. The woman pressed, "He never says thank you." Li Mei just smiled. "He doesn't need to." But later she wondered if that was true. That evening, after she finished scrubbing the kitchen floor, she found another note in the bowl. This time it wasn't on bark. It was on silk paper. Soft, pale, finer than anything she had ever touched. Only 5 words. Do you still not ask? No name, no seal, but the handwriting was the same. She read it once, then twice, then folded it carefully and sat on the floor, hands in her lap, staring into the dark. The next morning she did something different. She brought 2 bowls, one for him and one for herself. When she reached the wall, he looked up, surprised. She sat beside him, not close, but close enough to hear the sound of his breath. She placed both bowls between them. He didn't speak. Neither did she. They ate in silence. The rice was plain. The pickles were bitter, but it was the first time in years she hadn't eaten alone. When they finished, she gathered the bowls and stood. He looked at her, and then quietly he said, "My name is Wren." She blinked. It wasn't a royal name, not the kind that echoed through halls, not the kind that sat on scrolls or coins, but it felt real, weighty, true. She nodded once. "I'm Lee May," and for the first time since she met him, he smiled. Not wide, not bold, but the kind of smile that comes after years of forgetting how. Wren did not speak often. Even after sharing his name, he remained quiet, watchful, but something had shifted. Lee May felt it in the way he looked at her now, not with the guarded stare of a wounded man, but with the softened gaze of someone trying to remember how to be seen. They didn't sit together every day, only sometimes, when the tea house wasn't too busy, when the streets weren't too loud, when she could afford to bring an extra bowl. On those mornings she brought 2 spoons, and he never asked why. One day she brought warm sweet potatoes, soft, steamed in cloth, touched with salt and ginger. She set them down as usual, knelt beside him, and waited. He reached slowly, but just as he took the first bite, he paused. His hand trembled. "Is it poisoned?" she asked softly, half joking. He shook his head. "No." Then, after a moment, "It's just been a long time since anything tasted like kindness." Lee May didn't answer. She only looked down at her own food. But inside her chest something stirred. That afternoon the wind carried dust from the northern road. The tea house closed early. Lee May finished cleaning the courtyard and slipped away before sunset. She walked through the side alleys, turned the corner near the stone bridge, and stopped. The wall was empty. The bowl was gone. So was he. Her chest tightened. She waited a moment, then longer. Nothing, just dust and leaves. She told herself he had left for good reason, to rest perhaps, or to find another place to sit. But something in her stomach refused to believe it. That night, she slept poorly. The room felt colder, the wind louder. She woke 3 times without knowing why, and each time she found herself looking toward the small wooden box where the notes were kept, just to be sure they were still there. By morning the sky had turned silver with frost. She rose early, packed a smaller bowl, and walked to the wall. Still empty. She lingered. Then, as she turned to leave, she heard a sound. Not loud. A step. A breath. She turned. And there he was, leaning against the side of a cart across the street. Standing. Barely. His shoulder pressed to the wooden frame. His leg trembling, but upright. Walking. She rushed to him without thinking. He didn't speak. Just looked at her, the way someone might look at the first light after a long night. "I thought," she began, but the words caught. He gave the smallest of nods. "I was followed." She blinked. "Followed?" He looked down. "I saw someone watching you, near the corner by the plum vendor. They weren't local." Her blood ran cold. "You're sure?" "Yes." "And you, why would anyone follow you?" A pause. Then, very quietly, "Because I wasn't supposed to live." She didn't ask more. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached into her satchel, pulled out the small bowl of rice and sweet potato, and offered it to him like she always did. Wren took it, held it in both hands, then sat on the edge of the cartwheel and began to eat, slowly, reverently, like someone tasting safety for the first time. Lee May sat beside him in silence. The street was nearly empty. No voices, no footsteps, just the sound of two strangers breathing in the cold air, pretending for one moment that the world outside didn't exist. The alley was quiet, but not the safe kind of quiet, the kind that listens, that watches. Li Mei felt it even before Ren stood, even before he turned toward the rooftops and narrowed his eyes. Something in the air had shifted, like a question waiting to be answered. He didn't finish the rice. He handed the bowl back, gently, carefully, and said just one word, "Go." She stared at him. "What?" "Go back to the tea house, slowly. Don't look behind. You don't come here again." She didn't move. He looked at her, not coldly, not harshly, but with the weight of someone who had carried too many goodbyes. "You shouldn't be seen with me anymore." Her voice came out dry. "Tell why?" Ren hesitated. Then, softly, "Because the people who hurt me still want me gone." He turned his face slightly, enough for her to see the edge of the scar beneath his ear. It disappeared beneath the collar of his tattered robe. It wasn't a robbery. It wasn't an accident. Li Mei's breath caught. "And the mark?" she whispered. "On the paper?" He didn't answer, but his eyes said yes. A crest, a seal, something not meant for commoners to recognize, but she had, even if she didn't know how, even if her heart had known long before, her mind. He stepped back into shadow. The street swallowed him again. Li Mei remained frozen for a moment, the bowl still warm in her hands. Then she turned and walked, slowly, like he told her. But every step felt like glass. That night she said nothing to anyone. Not to the kitchen girl who asked if she was tired, not to the tea master who scolded her for burning the dumplings, not even to the cat who brushed against her leg under the table. She just moved through the motions, boiled the water, swept the floor, closed the shutters. But in her chest, something refused to settle. He hadn't said goodbye, not properly. He had only vanished, like a man trained to disappear. When the wind woke her before dawn, she rose without thinking, wrapped the bowl, packed a small cloth of steamed buns, and slipped out the back door. The alley was empty, but something was different. At the base of the wall, where she always left the bowl, there was something else. A dagger wrapped in silk, the hilt carved with the same symbol from the note, and tied to it, a strand of red thread, the kind used only for binding imperial scrolls. Li Mei touched it gently. Her fingers trembled, and suddenly she knew. He hadn't just been hiding, he had been hunted. She took the dagger, wrapped it again, and returned to the tea house without speaking to anyone. But that night, she didn't sleep, because for the first time, she wasn't worried about who he was. She was terrified of who wanted him gone. The dagger stayed beneath her bed. Li Mei wrapped it in cloth and laid it beside her father's comb in the bark with the first note. All the quiet truths she had no words for. She didn't tell anyone. Not the old cook with kind eyes. Not the boy who cleaned the lanterns. She carried the secret alone, because she knew now, this wasn't about charity. This was a crossing of worlds, and she had stepped into something she was never meant to touch. For 2 days, Ren didn't appear. The wall remained empty. Street too quiet. She still brought the bowl, still left it in its place, but the food stayed untouched, the bowl unreturned. And each night she lit the candle by the window and waited for something she didn't know how to name. On the third night, just before the candle died, she heard it. A knock. Soft. 3 times. Not on her door. On the back gate of the tea house. She froze, wrapped her shawl tighter, slipped outside. The alley was dark, lit only by moonlight and memory. He stood just beyond the gate, covered in dust, hood drawn, limping, but alive. Barely. "Come inside," she whispered. He shook his head. "They saw you," he said. She stepped closer. "They know your face now." Her breath caught. "Who?" He looked past her, toward the closed tea house window. "The ones who followed me. The ones I tried to lose. They saw you speaking to me." She didn't ask what that meant. She already knew. She had seen it before, when a merchant's daughter was punished for helping a runaway, when a boy had vanished after delivering the wrong message. This wasn't just fear, this was survival. Ren reached into his robe, pulled something wrapped, silk, a ring, simple but carved with the same crest. "I don't have time to explain," he said, "but if anything happens, show this to the guards at the north gate." She took it with shaking hands. He stepped back, then stopped. "I shouldn't have let you sit with me." Her throat tightened. "Why did you?" He looked at her for a long time, then said softly, "Because I forgot how it felt to be treated. Like a man." He vanished into the dark, and this time he didn't say when he'd return. The next day the tea house burned, not to the ground, only the back store room. The flames were small, controlled, but deliberate. No one was hurt. The guards called it an accident, but Li Mei knew better. It wasn't a message, it was a warning. She stood in the smoke, holding the bowl he once ate from, her heart pounding not with fear, but with resolve. They wanted her to be afraid, but she was done being silent. That night she didn't cry. She took the ring, the dagger, and the note with the words, "Do you still not ask?" She placed them in her satchel and packed a second set of clothes, because if they had come this far to find him, they would have to face her too. The wind had changed. It no longer smelled of tea leaves and ash, but of distance, of things that were ending. Li Mei stood outside the tea house for the last time just before dawn. She wore her plain robe, the green one with the patched sleeves. Her satchel rested over one shoulder, and in her pocket, wrapped in cloth, the ring, the one he told her to show, the one that would either open a gate or seal her fate. She didn't look back, not at the garden, not at the roof, not at the window where she used to wait for the first light. There was no one to say goodbye. Judy, no one who would understand what she was about to do. Only her footsteps, soft and steady, echoing through the morning fog. The north gate was nearly empty. 2 guards stood beneath the arched stone, yawning into their sleeves, their spears planted loosely in the dust. Behind them, the imperial road stretched like a line drawn in silence, toward mountains, toward rivers, toward places she had only heard of in whispers. She approached slowly. One of the guards raised his hand. "Halt! This path is closed." She bowed, then reached into her pocket and unwrapped the ring. No words, just an open palm. The other guard stepped forward, eyes narrowing. He stared, then stared again. And then without speaking, he turned and disappeared through a side door. Moments later, a third man appeared, older, armor trimmed in red. He took the ring, studied it, then looked at Li Mei. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated. Then, "Li Mei." His eyes narrowed. "You're the one he spoke of." She didn't ask who, didn't need to. He nodded once, then stepped aside. "Follow me." They didn't walk through the main road. They went around through a narrow corridor hidden behind the gate wall. Cold stone beneath her feet, silence all around, and the quiet tension of a place that had forgotten how to welcome strangers. At the end of the corridor stood a pavilion, smaller than she imagined, but guarded on all sides. The soldier stopped. "Wait here." She did, not because she was told, but because her legs had begun to tremble. Then the doors opened, and he was there. Ren, but not Ren. Not the man she had fed in the dust, not the man who limped from the shadows. He stood tall now, wearing robes she had never seen, deep blue, lined with silver, a sash across his chest bearing the same crest from the dagger, clear now, unmistakable, a prince's seal. His hair had been tied back, his wounds cleaned, but his eyes were the same. He stepped forward slowly, and for a moment they just looked at each other. She didn't bow, he didn't speak. The silence between them said more than any title ever could. Then, quietly, he asked, "Why did you come?" Her throat tightened. Because they tried to make me afraid of you. And you weren't. I was, she looked down, but not of you. Only of losing what I didn't realize I'd found. Ren stepped closer, his voice softer now. You fed me when I had nothing. You listened when I said nothing. You sat beside me when even I had forgotten who I was. He reached into his sleeve, pulled something small, her ribbon. The blue one she'd used to tie the first bowl. He had kept it. She stared at it, then looked at him. I don't understand, she whispered. Why me? He didn't answer at first. Then, in a voice that no longer belonged to a beggar, because you never asked what I was. You just saw me. That night she didn't return to the tea house. She stayed in the pavilion, in a room prepared for her with fresh sheets, warm water, and silence that felt nothing like fear. Only weight, the kind that comes from knowing that the world has already changed, and now it's waiting to see who you will be inside it. The pavilion was quiet in the mornings. No servants rushed through the halls. No voices echoed through the stone. Only the rustle of leaves in the courtyard trees, and the soft breath of koi beneath the water's surface. It wasn't the palace, but it was a place apart from the world, and in it, Li Mei remained, not as a guest, not as a servant, just as herself. Ren no longer wore the rags of a crippled man, but he also no longer hid behind titles. In the eyes of the Empire, he had returned from the dead, the fourth prince, once left to die after a failed coup, now reborn in silence. Yet he refused to reclaim a throne. He did not return to the court. He chose the garden, the quiet, the one woman who never asked anything of him. Some days, they didn't speak at all. Li Mei prepared tea while Ren cleaned the inkstones. She tended to the herb beds. He carved wooden combs quietly with hands once trained for war. And every evening, just before the sun disappeared behind the pavilion walls, they shared a bowl. Rice. Simple, warm, sometimes with sweet lotus root, sometimes just broth, but always together, and always in the same bowl she had first carried. To the wall. One morning a letter arrived, sealed in black wax, summoning him back to the palace. Li Mei found him reading it beneath the cherry tree, his face unreadable. When she knelt beside him, he didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he said, "They're asking me to marry." Her heart did not stop. It simply paused. He looked at her. "They say the Empire needs an heir, a proper consort, a woman with bloodlines." Li Mei didn't speak, didn't cry. She only looked down at her hands, the same hands that once trembled offering a spoon to a stranger in the dust. And then, softly she said, "I understand." He turned toward her. "No," he said, "you don't." She met his eyes, and in them she saw it, the decision already made, not by duty, not by blood, but by choice. "I told them I already belong to someone," he said. They laughed. He reached into his sleeve, pulled out a ribbon, her ribbon, faded now, wrinkled, but whole. "I told them I was saved by a woman with no rank, no coin, no reason to love me, and that she was the only part of my life I'd never trade for a crown." That night, the stars hung low. The wind moved through the trees like a prayer, and in the garden pavilion, the prince who had once hidden behind silence sat beside the woman who had fed him without questions. No titles, no ceremony, just two bowls, and two hands reaching across the space between them, not for power, not for glory, only for peace. Years later, the story would be told in whispers, of a crippled beggar who was more than he seemed, of a tea house girl who gave without asking, and of a prince who returned from the dead, not to rule but to be seen. No one remembered their wedding day, because there wasn't one, but they remembered the garden, the bowl, the silence that spoke louder than oaths, and the love that bloomed without needing a name.
If this story touched you, consider subscribing. It's free, but for us, it means everything.